Death is coming for all of us. And what is going to happen to your comic collection on the day that it comes for you? Well, if you don't have a plan, what's likely going to happen is that a family member is going to inherit it who doesn't know what to do with it. And so they're going to take this collection that you've invested a lot of time and money into, hoping that you could leave something behind to help your family financially, and they're going to turn around and sell that collection for pennies on the dollar, once again, just because they won't know what to do. Or perhaps even worse, they're going to read some article online about how an Amazing Fantasy 15 sold for $1 million, and they're going to think, oh, I just inherited $1 million collection. And they're going to try to sell it for way above market value and end up just getting really frustrated when no one will pay the prices they think they deserve. And they'll get angry when they think people are just trying to lowball them. Meanwhile, the people who are actually trying to buy the comics are also going to go frustrated that your family member is asking what's really unreasonable prices. And eventually what's probably going to happen is your family member will just throw their hands up in the air, frustrated at it all, and then just revert to the first scenario, and ultimately then just saying, fine, I'll take pennies on the dollar. I just want to get rid of these comics. Now, both of those scenarios are nightmare situations for me. As a collector investor, I'm buying comics because I love to hold them and to have them, but I also do want to leave something behind that ends up benefiting my family as much as financially possible. And so I don't want them to get pennies on the dollar for what they're worth. In other words, I don't want to spend thousands of dollars for my family only to end up with $1,000 or a few $100s when they could get so much more if they were someone who were knowledgeable. And so today we're going to talk about different scenarios and options you have so that your family can benefit from your collection after your death. So first of all, we're going to talk about the dream scenario. And this is the scenario where you actually do have a family member, a child, or even a spouse that loves your collection just as much as you do and is knowledgeable about comics, and then so you can simply pass it on to them, and then they can take it and either hold on to the collection themselves or end up selling it for what ends up being full market value. Well, even this dream scenario can lead to some tricky situations, because let's imagine that you have multiple kids who are interested in your comic collection. What do you do then? Well, I think you have a couple of options, and I don't think these are necessarily right or wrong, but there's some pros and cons to each approach. Well, first of all, you could just decide to leave your collection as a whole to the estate. And then you could decide, well, I'll just let my kids figure out who will get which comics, or to decide whether they're going to sell the collection at full market value or hold on to it. And you leave it for them to decide. And the good thing about this is that, first of all, it doesn't take a lot of time for you. You just leave it as an estate. Secondly, it gives your kids more power to decide what to do with them. And third of all, you don't create any hurt feelings by saying, well, I'm leaving this book to that kid and that book to that kid. And yeah, they figure it out themselves. But the disadvantages are that it could lead to some squabbling among your family. Because what happens if they both want, let's say, your Incredible Hulk 181, the centerpiece of your collection. Well, Billy wants it, but so does Jane, and it means a lot to both of them, and they end up having a falling out as a family. I mean, that's kind of the worst case scenario, but at the very minimum, get angry at each other, or maybe Billy wants to sell the collection, Jane wants to hold on to it, and it says, how could you sell Dad's collection? It can just lead to these disagreements among them. And so if my kids end up enjoying comics, which is to be determined because they're all still young, but if they grow up and they're all interested in the collection, I'm going to go with a different option, and I'm going to designate certain comics to them in my will. It's very important, if you want certain things to go to certain people, that you put it in your will. If you just say, oh, well, Jane, I want Billy to have the Hulk 181 when I die. If it's not in the will, she can contest that. And so you want to make a will which is what I would do, and say, well, my Hulk 181 will go to Billy, my Daredevil 1 and Journey into Mystery, 85 will go to Jane, and then just kind of keep going down the list. And the benefit of this is that once again you spare any squabbling between the family. And then secondly, I think it actually makes which book each kid ends up with feel more meaningful to them. Billy would be saying like, oh yeah, Dad really wanted me to have the Hulk 181. That really means a lot. We connected over Wolverine. While Jane says, well, I remember how Dad and I used to talk about how cool Daredevil was. And so it really means a lot to me that he left the Daredevil 1 to me. Now, the disadvantage, of course, is that one of them could feel slighted and be jealous that Dad left the 181 to Billy or something like that. But for me, I'd rather them be angry at me once I'm dead than fighting with each other. And even still, if there's hurt feelings because of their anger at me, that could cause some squabbling. Families are obviously tricky things, but I want to limit as much squabbling as I can, and so I will designate those comics to them. Now, another scenario that could come up is, what if some of your children like your comic collection, but others don't? What do you do then? Again, I think there's a couple of options. Well, you could just say, hey, I really enjoyed, as we keep using this Billy and Jane scenario, those aren't my kids' names, but I'll just use it for the sake of argument. And so I could say, well, Billy and I just really bonded over comic collecting, and so I am just going to leave them all to him. It's just a bonus thing for him. And obviously that would be really meaningful to him, but what could happen in that scenario, of course, is Jane feel really left out and hurt, even though she didn't really care for comics, especially if you have some that are worth some money. And so what I would do in that situation is, in my will, I would designate them just to Billy because she doesn't care about them, but I would find some other tangible asset that means something to her that would be valuable, comparably to these comic collections, and I would designate that to her. So maybe like a car that we have or something like that. And I would try to keep it as even as I could. And that's just what I would do. Again, there's no necessarily right or wrong. But again, here we're talking about the ideal scenario where you do have at least one child, or again, it could be a spouse or a nephew or someone else that's close to you that is interested in comics that you leave them to. But what is certainly the more common scenario is that you're not going to have a family member who cares about comics at all. And so what do you do then? Well, I think you've got a couple of options that make sense to me, and I'm curious to hear other options you guys would consider in the comments below. But there are two options that I will consider that I've seen people who have successfully set their family up financially with their comic collection do. The first is that as you approach old age, you could start selling off the collection yourself. You can say, hey, well, I've enjoyed these books for 30 or 40 years. I've got a few years left here on this planet, and I am just going to start selling them. And the benefit of that, of course, is that you will probably get the very top dollar you ever would for your collection. You will know exactly how to price them. You're knowledgeable of comics, and you will take the time to get the most amount of money that you can then leave behind to your family. Another benefit to this approach is that you save your children the headache, the hassle, and the time that it would take for them to have to sell those comics. And it really can be a hassle, especially if you're trying to sell a big collection. And so you're saving them from having to deal with it at all, and all they'll inherit is a bunch of money. Now, one of the downsides of this approach is that you have to actually give up your collection during your lifetime. And I know that's something that I don't want to do. Even though I'll be very happy to have my Daredevil 1 for 30, 40 years, I want it for 41, 42. I want to own it until the moment I die and always be able to say, man, I've got my Daredevil number 1. Also, if you take this approach, then you may be saving your kids time, but it's going to take a lot of time on your end. And when you're in your 70s or 80s, you have to ask, do I really want to be spending my last few years of my life going through the hassle and headache of selling my comic collection? You might think, well, yeah, my kids are going to get $20,000 worth of comics. They can at least put in a little bit of time to get that money. I don't need to put in that time. Now, the second option that you could consider, and this is the one that I will be taking, is that you could make sure that you send off your most valuable books, which of course that's a subjective definition, but I think for me that means books that are worth more than $100. Send them off to get graded, because if your children inherit graded books, it's going to be so much easier for them to sell versus raw books, because they'll know exactly what they're worth. If they don't know much about comics, it's going to be hard to figure out, well, what's this Daredevil one worth? First of all, you've got to figure out, well, what's the condition? And if you're a novice at this, you might not be able to accurately determine the grade. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times that I've reached out to someone who inherited a collection and they told me, oh, I have these near mint copies, and they end up being mid-grade copies. And when that happens, it ends up leading to dissatisfaction. They're angry because I try to be nice about it, but I'm not going to pay the price that they're asking. I'm upset because I'm like, oh, I'm willing to give you a fair price, but it's not working out. But anyway, but if they're graded, your children don't have to worry about trying to figure out their condition, and they don't have to worry about figuring out how to guess their price, because if you show them, this is what I'll do. I'll teach my children, or at this point, my wife, my children are old enough, I've shown her how to go to eBay and look up, okay, I've got a Daredevil number 1, 3.0, what is it worth? And this is what you can sell it for. And it just makes the selling process easy peasy. And so that's what I'm going to do, and the reasons that's beneficial, in addition to the easiness of your kids selling it, is that, again, you get to keep your collection until the day you die. And that's what I really like. And another benefit to this option is that you make your comics easy to sell for your kids if you end up dying early from some kind of accident. I'm hoping that I live to be in my 90s or my hundreds, but what happens next week if I'm in some kind of car accident, or I get some kind of sickness at an early age and I don't make it to my 70s? And especially if it's something sudden that happens and I don't have time to sell off my collection, well, it's going to be hard for my kids to sell it if, again, everything is raw and they don't really know anything about comics. Now, there are some disadvantages to this approach. First of all, of course, you're not getting everything graded. So then what does happen to the raw books that you still have in your collection? Well, for me, I know that they aren't going to be worth nearly as much, and so I've told my wife that, hey, anything that's not graded, I know some people who will basically give you 50% of full market value. Just take it to them. And that way it's not a headache or a hassle, but it does mean they won't get full market value the way that you could if you end up selling those comics yourself. But I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to say, hey, I've got some other comics that are worth maybe $3,000 or $4,000. It's worth my family just getting $1,500 to $2,000 for those comics that are harder and more time intensive to sell, so that they don't have to deal with a headache. Those are just comics that I'll say, hey, they really weren't investment comics, but they were just ones that I love and enjoyed, and I'm willing to take that hit so that my family doesn't have to deal with that hassle. But even though this saves a lot of hassle to your family, not selling your comics yourself will ultimately still leave some amount of hassle and time that your family has to deal with. Now, another disadvantage is to this approach of getting your comics graded, your more valuable ones, is that, of course, there's a bigger upfront cost. It's not cheap to get your books graded, right? And so you might not be willing to spend that amount of money, even if you think eventually it'll be recouped. It's just a lot of money up front. And another disadvantage is that you just might like your books raw. Maybe you don't like the idea of never being able to open your comic again. And that's a totally legit thing. And so that option might not be for you. But I think it is the option for me. Yeah, and I could do some kind of hybrid. I was thinking about this, where if I do make it to my 70s or 80s, I certainly don't sell off my big time keys. But yeah, maybe there's some $10 books and $20 books that, I don't really care for anymore, and I end up selling those. And maybe end up selling those, then funneling them into a big time book, a big key that would be easy to sell and awesome to own the last couple of years of my life. Maybe I get that Amazing Fantasy 15 for the last 2 years of my life or something like that. So those are just some of the scenarios and options that I've thought through what will happen to my comics when I die. But I'm curious, are there any other options that you guys have considered? Or is this something you even think about at all? Personally, I don't think as a whole we think about our death nearly enough. And yeah, that can seem kind of gloomy or morbid, but I don't mean it in that way. What I mean is that if we thought about our death and our mortality more often, I think we would make much wiser choices. Whenever we're thinking about doing something or buying something, we ask, hey, is this really going to matter on my deathbed? And that's something I really ask myself a lot, again, especially with kids. I want to leave a legacy for them, and I know that I'm not going to be here for them for 100 years. And so I want to use my time wisely. So anyway, that's just kind of a tangent thing, but I think it's something worth considering. So hope you've enjoyed this video. Tell me what you think. Of course, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'd encourage you to consider doing so. We are continually getting closer and closer to the 400 subscriber, where I'll be giving away 4 Spider-Woman #1s. And so look forward to giving those books away. Like the video, all those things that help our channel out. All right, thanks again, and I look forward to the next one.